"Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven," is this beautiful line in the Lord's Prayer that basically is the prayer that we humans will follow God's ways, that we will follow this larger cosmic, spiritual, transcendent wisdom and behavior right here on earth in our own lives. But how is thy will actually done in heaven? How does it work? What does it look like? Now, as Charles Fillmore emphasized, it's important for us to relate our spiritual and religious understandings to the science of the day, to have a dialogue. And Charles himself had quite a scientific bent, as I think you know. And he certainly did this in his own way. And if you read some of his science of the day, he talks about the ethereal realms, ether. There was a thought in the 20s and 30s that there might be this cosmic ether. That's an idea that goes in and out of fashion. But in any case, what's emerging now? How is thy will done in heaven? There's a new kind of understanding that's emerging from quantum physics. You've all heard about quantum physics, I'm sure, and we'll be delving into that more in our Monday night series, which we will announce and begin in February. We'll announce it soon, but we'll begin the process in February. Quantum physics is coming up with answers. And one of the key ones is what is called a quantum entanglement, which basically says that everything is connected to everything else. It's a pretty simple idea. It has radical consequences because it means in the depths of our own being, we are directly connected to the universe. But that's what we've been saying all along, right? And we've been saying through the gateway of the heart, we can make that connection real. So quantum physics has its own way of speaking about this. And what has emerged in the last 10 or 15 years, drawing on the work of physicist David Bohm, who we've talked about in the past, and others, is that what they call the holographic principle, which is really an application of the fractal nature of reality. And to make it very simple, the holographic principle basically says that as the physical world, the entire universe is actually a projection of the spiritual world. And that's really a very beautiful idea to be emerging in science now, because it's helping science to get out of its sort of materialist box, if you will. And it also says that these non-material worlds are not local. Now, the way this is described in the contemporary understanding of the holographic principle, here's a grapefruit. Imagine that this grapefruit is the entire universe, the billions, 100 billion galaxies, which have, each one of which has 100 billion stars. So this is a big grapefruit, right? And outside of this grapefruit is a two-dimensional, or actually several of them, but two-dimensional plane of some kind, on which the entire content, every last detail about what goes on in this physical, observable universe is encoded, is somehow written here. And then what happens is divine light shines upon this, and voila, the physical universe appears. I'm not sure which images you're showing, but that's a good one. So this, and the relationship between the two is this, the gap between this and this is one aspect of the quantum entanglement. So this universe is the consequence, the physical, three-dimensional consequence in matter, space, and time of the divine script that's written in this two-dimensional hyperspace. Now, there are different theories. There may be several of these, so there could be several of these pages floating around, each one of which is somehow playing a role in sending the divine plan, if you will, down to the universe. I think I'm going to put the universe back here so it doesn't roll off. Now we've left the universe and now we're going into the spiritual verse. Okay, so the other thing is that they have this holographic structure, that in some sense, each part of this universe contains the entire universe. We've talked about that previously. And to give an example of a holographic, how it works in science, we have this image here. This is actually the physicist Brian Greene from one of his NOVA series, who's written the book Elegant Universe, which is a good one if you're interested in these things. But he's standing next to his holographic image. So there's a life-size holographic image there. And then if you go to the next slide, he's actually, there's another slide that's missing. Go back a couple. Well, it's okay. Go back to the previous slide. Okay, well, if you can bring him up again. Well, actually, go back to that one. That's a good one right there, because that's another conception of how the universe springs from this two-dimensional plane. So you see the person there is holding in their hands this piece of paper, and then the entire cosmos springs up from it as a projection. And now if we go back to Brian Greene and his holographic double. So he is actually standing next to this thing, and then he walks around it. So if we come to the next slide. Oh, there he is. Now he's facing. And this is a life-size, three-dimensional. A hologram is a three-dimensional object, not two dimensions. So this body that he's facing has the same volume, same height exactly as he does. And now he can walk around it. So you can see if you look there and towards the right of the picture, there's the hologram. And he's now walking around that back to, where does that come from, that projection? And he comes back to here. It comes from a light source that is projected onto a holographic screen. And that gives rise to this three-dimensional hologram. So, what does this all mean? Well, what quantum physics is beginning to say is that not only is that hologram a hologram, but Brian Greene is also a hologram. That each one of us is also a hologram. Of course, God's better at doing things than we are. That's why he looks so good. The one is really kind of crude and fuzzy and almost, mystical looking, like it's not very high res. But God can make the ultimate high-res, high-definition hologram. And the idea is that each one of us is that, and that the entire visible, manifest universe is that everything created in matter, space, and time is that. So this is the idea that's emerging. And these are some images. For example, this one shows how a black hole is embedded within this holographic half dome. So that two-dimensional holographic surface, instead of being a flat one like this, is a curved dome. But all of the information contained and all of the reality contained in the black hole or the universe, either one, is inscribed on that larger half dome surface. And all of this emerged from the discovery, which is now mathematically demonstrated, that in any three-dimensional object, all of the information that's going on inside is actually written on its surface mathematically. There's a way in which the mathematical surface contains all of the information of everything that goes on in the interior. So this has led to this whole understanding in quantum physics. It's pretty radical. It's quite widely accepted, but I will say it's not the only theory. Stephen Hawking was doubting it for quite some time, but he finally conceded that this looks like it has a lot of validity to it. This image here is what, if you take a look at a photographic plate and say, well, where'd that come from? You go look at the photograph, this is what you see. Pretty boring, right? Now, the reason it's boring is because the information is there, but the image has not yet been replicated. It'd be a little bit like if someone brings you a CD, they bring you a CD and say, hey, there's this beautiful music. You really got to hear this CD. It's so fantastic. And so the person takes the CD and puts it up to their ear, and you strive and you try to hear it, and then you look at it and I don't know, maybe something's wrong with my ears. I don't hear a thing. Okay, well, why is that? Obviously because the information has to be retrieved from that record. if you will. That the CD's a little two-dimensional record, but if you put it in the right little instrument, in this case, obviously a CD player, bring it out, then suddenly all this music comes. Same idea with that photo we just saw. When laser lights, a reference beam and interactive beam come and interact, suddenly this whole three-dimensional hologram appears. And the idea is that that is how the physical universe is. Now, this can be a little disconcerting. It's like, you mean we're just some kind of floaty image that's not really real? And in some ways, yes, that's what this is suggesting. That's why some people have a little problem with it. But as Einstein showed in his general relativity theory, matter and space and time, all of these things emerge simultaneously out of nothing. That basically matter, space, and time are not ultimate realities. They are contingent realities. This is really important. And if we take this seriously, what we begin to realize is that this is actually the beginnings of a scientific validation of everything that we speak of in spiritual life. So, for example, it provides a validation of the third unity principle that our thoughts basically create our experiences. Because in this grapefruit, thought is able to get outside of the physical universe. It has a kind of level of reality beyond the physical universe that enables us to even communicate and discuss and talk about these things. And I would suggest that the power of the heart has a reality that goes beyond thought, as we've been saying. And so there are these layers and levels. But the whole point here is that this is a kind of way of understanding these principles that have been spoken of by the spiritual masters across the ages. And there's a lot of parallels. So I want to just run through a couple of those. First of all, it suggests that our bodies, what are they? Are they really real? Are they made of light or made of thin air kind of thing? Because if it's just a holographic projection, if you turn off that light, suddenly it'll disappear. And that actually is the understanding both of the ancient mystics and of contemporary physics. The ancient mystics spoke to the fact that the entire universe is created in its entirety, moment to moment. Meister Eckhart said it very specifically. He said, all of God's creation is fully created now, in each moment. And you find similar statements across the mystical traditions. So this is something that has been known by those who have deeper knowing. How did they know it? Their consciousness was able to leave the confines of the visible physical universe and go beyond and tap into one of these heavenly templates. So it helps us to understand how that could be. And what does that mean about our physical bodies? Are they just an illusion? Yes and no. At one level, they're not ultimately real, but at another level, of course, we feel them, they're solid. And quantum physics is explaining to us how that works. One thing it explains to us, for example, is that our bodies are mostly empty space, that all of the physical universe is mostly empty space. And actually, if you squeeze out the gaps, the empty spaces in your own physical body, it would collapse to a speck of dust so tiny you can't even see it. If you took the entire human family, all 7 billion human beings, and put them all together and then compress them just to get rid of all the empty space into a little ball, it'd be about the size of an apple. Now that apple would weigh 700 billion pounds, but hey, everybody's inside it, so it's a little heavy. That is not just metaphor, that is the current understanding that comes from the nature of matter in quantum physics. And so the second thing is that this gives a kind of explanation of spiritual healing in a way. Because if we are a contingent projection, if our physical body, for example, is this projection of another reality, then if we have access to that other reality, if we can pierce to where we can begin to change the script on that heavenly template, that will then change the physical reality of our bodies. And how do we do that? We do it through prayer. We do it through somehow reaching that transcendent reality, which are the templates. In physics they call them, nonlocal hyperplanes. Nonlocal means it's not here exactly. However, and this is very important, everything on those hyperplanes, everything on those heavenly templates is interpenetrating with every single point in space-time. Every aspect of the creation is infused with these divine templates, with these cosmic Akashic records, if you will, whatever name we give to them, that the entire creation is infused with those. And we are infused with those. So we are swimming in this sea of divinity. And in fact, what quantum physics is also telling us, not only is matter mostly empty space, but space is also grainy. Space is granular. And if you go down with an accurate enough microscope, which we don't have, so this is obviously the theory, but if we go down and look at space closely enough, it's made of little dots, and there's gaps in those dots. And what shines through those gaps? What shines through are basically God's divine design, these heavenly realms, which all the spiritual traditions agree and tell us that this is a realm that is profoundly beautiful, where everything is harmonious, where God's will is automatically done, and where there is this kind of glorious celebration of divinity at each and every moment. And this line in the Lord's Prayer is a prayer for us here on this little planet to align our lives with that larger cosmic beauty and harmony. And then we will have, in our little projected life here, a replica of the majestic, glorious, divine light of the heavens. That is the prayer that Jesus holds for us and asks us to pray when we pray this line in the Lord's Prayer. So just remember next time when you're debating with someone and they tell you, well, you know what, your argument is full of holes. You can say, well, you know what, your entire being is nothing but holes, big ones. And science proves it. So that should silence them for a while. So this has another very important application. And next week I'll be speaking at a conference in Korea, which is called the First International Conference on God and Science. And they're looking at spiritual solutions. Well, they're looking at solutions, creative solutions to the environmental problems. And this is really important to see the application here. And to do that, let's begin with a brief reminder of the parable of the prodigal son. So I think you all know the story, but we have this father, he has two sons, and one of the younger son basically comes and says, give me your inheritance now. I don't want to wait until you die. Give it to me now. And the father does so, and he basically has, a nice pot of money, and he heads out of Dodge, and goes off and lives basically a wanton life of debauchery and abandon, and at some point he's starving, literally, because he runs out of money. He squanders it all. He's now starving. He tries to find a job. He finds a job working for some farmer, and even the food that he's feeding to the pigs begins to look attractive to him. And he finally has a moment of total surrender where he comes and he says, he recognizes what he's done. And he recognizes how he has squandered his father's whole inheritance. And now he's penniless, he's starving. He needs to go home because it's the only place he can go where he can get even a decent meal. And he says, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before thee. Now he says this in his own prayer. He hasn't gone home yet. I have sinned against heaven and before thee, and I am no more worthy to be called thy son. Make me as one of thy hired servants. And he arose and went home. But when he was still a ways off from his home, his father saw him and had compassion and ran to him and fell upon him and kissed him. And then his father called a huge celebration. And there's more details to the story. The brother got jealous, and we won't go into those details. But here's the key point, is that he basically had left the spiritual world. He was not living according to thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. But he was basically living out the life of the self-important ego. And what happened was that didn't work, and he basically came to a place of complete surrender and came back. Now, when we think of the ecological crisis on our beloved planet Earth, we are all aware that at this time the Earth is changing because of human activity and because of climate change and pollution and our, in a sense, our greedy ways of living and our entire relationship to the Earth, which is one of exploitation in many ways. And we have basically desacralized the Earth into a sort of a resource bank in which we just draw for our own pleasure. And we know from environmental science that this is changing the Earth irreparably. And it's incredibly dangerous. And that particularly the climate and the way that the climate is changing seems to be something that's irreversible. And I don't deny that we have the potential to destroy ourselves and even other species and potentially all life. However, I've been an environmental scientist for 25, 30 years of my life, and I've been a spiritual seeker for an equal amount of time, and those two have overlapped for some long period. And my personal conviction is that the Earth also has its spiritual Akashic records. The Earth is a spiritual being. The Earth, it's sometimes called the anima mundi, the soul of the Earth. And that this part of the Earth extends beyond its physical body. And that we, in our prayer for the Earth, need to connect with the Earth's spiritual body and bring into our prayers the healing of the Earth through connecting with its spiritual essence. And this is something that I think the mainstream materialist scientific worldview does not yet recognize. And so the scenarios of doom and gloom are very real if we continue down that road. Just like with the prodigal son. He would have destroyed his life. And so I don't deny that at all. But if we turn around, we are like the prodigal children of this planet. And we've been behaving in that way. But if we make a turn of heart, and if we begin to work actively to change our relationship with these destructive technologies, and to heal the wound, heal the spiritual wound with our sacred planetary home, then my conviction is that the spiritual soul of the Earth and of the divine that holds the Earth in its larger embrace will all align with our will and will all empower our will and will actually celebrate as we begin to take responsibility for this sacred planetary home and begin to love it as it should be loved and begin to make the corrective behaviors. And because it's a whole holographic projection, climate change and all of these things could be healed like that if God were to choose. Now that may seem very simplistic. It could even seem dangerous because we can say, well, we can just party down and then when we're done, we say, hey, God, fix it. Doesn't work that way. But it does give me hope that the doom and gloom that we hear in the mainstream environmental science It's true, if we keep going our ways, I think those scenarios will manifest. But I take great hope that we can change our ways, and that as we do, the entire heavens will align with us, and that we can transform this crisis in relation to our planetary home. Not only transform the destructive ecological conditions, but also reclaim our sacred communion with our beloved planetary home. Because it is a holy hologram, and we are holy holograms, to use a scientific phrase. So let's just close for a moment. And let us just bring our sacred earth into our mind's eye. And ask that we do divine will here on earth as we move through our lives. And let us invite the anima mundi, the spirit and soul of the earth, into our hearts. And let us feel our hearts yearning to connect with the spiritual body of the earth. And in so doing, to connect us and the earth and God in a circle of prayer. That the earth may be healed, that our relationship may be healed, that we may reclaim God's intended plan for us to live out divine majesty, divine love, divine light here as the sons and daughters of God. Amen.